Hey everyone, welcome to Nerdarchy for Nerds by Nerds. I am Nerdarchist Ted, hanging out with lead Starfinder designer Owen Stephens, hanging out at Gen Con, and today we're going to talk about tabletop gaming, content creation, and the evolution of role-playing games. So Owen, do you want to explain who you are, where people can find you, what you do?
Sure. So I am a full-time employee of Paizo Publishing, where I am the design lead for the Starfinder role-playing game. I am also a developer for Green Ronin. I am also a developer for Wright Publishing, and I also run Rogue Genius Games, which is a tiny little game company you may have never heard of.
Well, I know and like Wright Publishing. I know and like the Starfinder stuff. So this is pretty awesome to have you here.
Thank you.
For those of you who might have watched the Starfinder release game, I got to actually be a player on that with you. That was an amazing experience for me.
It was a lot of fun.
So we're going to talk today about the evolution of what's going on with role-playing games, tabletop gaming, and you got some insights in that with all the different things that you've been a part of.
Yeah, I mean, I was a full-time freelancer from 2000 to 2014 before I took the Paizo job. And so as an independent creator, I thought it was very important to try and look at how people are absorbing role-playing games and coming to role-playing games and what it is they find interesting about role-playing games. So right now, for example, one of the ways that a lot of people are coming to Dungeons & Dragons, just as an example, is through the show Critical Role. A lot of the people that love and watch Critical Role don't play D&D. Some of them don't feel qualified to play D&D. That is an activity to them that professionals do for entertainment purposes.
I thought it was amusing. I'm unfortunately I can't remember exactly where I heard this story, but someone I was talking to said like they were that they were in school, like this was a high schooler, and they felt that they weren't cool enough to approach the table of the kids playing D&D.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh my gosh. Like, as a kid who, as a teenager, I was heavily into D&D. It was, second ed at that point in time. Pathfinder hadn't even come around yet.
No, not for a long time.
And it was like, all right, yeah, I'm the nerd, I'm the dork, I'm the kid that's rolling funny shaped dice. I had no problems talking about me doing this stuff, which is why I wasn't one of the popular kids. So to hear it the other way around, it's like, oh my God, nerddom is on the rise.
Well, and I think part of this is a general cultural shift, right? I mean, we've already had one set of Lord of the Rings movies. And then we had a set of Hobbit movies. And now Amazon is going to spend $1 billion on another set of Lord of the Rings movies. That is a change in what the general culture, pop culture in general, considers to be mainstream.
Well, I think Lord of the Rings, number one, that they took something that was like typically a very fantasy thing and they made it story-wise fantastic, visually above and beyond anything that anyone had ever seen, and lengthwise for a movie, it had broken through boundaries. So that it's like, okay, well, we can't even show you everything because we recorded too much. So if you wanted to watch it all, you had to wait until you bought the extended edition that was over 3.5 hours long. Like, oh my word! Like, I know people who sat in the theater for the 12 to 15 minutes just to watch all of the credits go by, and it was like,
yep. Well, and then if you want to watch the whole thing in one sitting, right? You're talking about watching all 3 extended editions. That's an 11-hour commitment.
That is, you are taking the bulk of your Saturday's waking hours or weekend waking hours just to consume all of it. It's amazing.
And there are a lot of people who are not in the traditional geek mode who have done that. And so that has totally changed what tabletop gaming and RPG gaming are perceived as. And I do think that there are things like the 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons was much more successful than the ones before it. 5th edition is proving to be very, very successful. People have begun doing better jobs at creating quick plays and introductory box sets, for example. We just announced recently that Starfinder is going to have a box set spring of 2019. That's going to be an introductory basic game. We can give you in one box everything you need to learn a role-playing game, to play the game. It'll have the dice, it'll have the miniatures, it'll have the map. And that is a way that Paizo is trying to take that experience and not just say, hey, if you want to play our game, you've got to look at this 500-page tome. For a lot of us that were looking at 200, 300 page tomes in the 80s and 90s, that's perfectly normal and reasonable sounding. For someone who has just, for example, seen Guardians of the Galaxy and thinks, that looks fun, I've seen some Starfinder art, that sort of looks like Guardians of the Galaxy, I want to do that, that 500-page book can be intimidating.
Absolutely.
But a box that says, here's everything you need, and then we get you starting in 15 and 20 minutes, that changes who can enter into that experience.
Well, I mean, if we jump back to, my childhood, I don't know where you were when Star Wars came out, but Star Wars, massively popular. They thought everything was going to be a bomb and the studio was wasting their money. And it became this massive franchise that still, many decades later is growing and thriving and, having a grand old time. Well, back then, okay, well, this was just media, just something to consume. And as it has grown and shifted and changed, it stayed out there in that mainstream medium, but it's sci-fi, and there has not been as widely successful, sci-fi RPGs. Yes, there are many choices out there, but none of them have stepped up to compete with, say, Pathfinder or Dungeons and Dragons. But what that tells us is there is a market out there, and as we see, as you mentioned, Lord of the Rings, and then further stepping up that Game of Thrones. Mm-hmm. These things are not in any direct correlation role-playing games, but it is showing interest and showing relativity to that content. Well, if you can take that same thing, it's like, okay, well, you like Star Wars, you like Guardians of the Galaxy. Well, how would you like to play Rocket Raccoon?
Right.
How would you like to play Star-Lord? Oh, that would be amazing. I can spend a couple hours pretending to be this guy and having fun and doing shootouts. Yeah, that sounds like a great time. Well, you can do that with Starfinder.
Yeah, and I think some of this is cause and effect and some of it just a shift in culture, right? When Star Wars became cool, that sort of changed how the sci-fi geeks were viewed. And I think RPGs have sort of piggybacked on that, and some RPGs are becoming cool. Or at least acceptable. You're not considered a weirdo or a pariah because you do these things. And that just expands the market that's available, how people look at it, who's willing to admit they do it even. Mm-hmm. And that is changing how the entire market works. You've got things like Kickstarter where you can say, hey, I want to get the money in advance for this thing I want to make. Uh-huh. If the audience is a small, dedicated audience, you just won't have enough people to back something like that. But then you have something like the recent Expanse licensed RPG Kickstarter. Uh-huh. So it's more than $250,000. It's based on a active, at the moment, television series, which is going over to Amazon Prime. Right. So it's the television show isn't even on cable television anymore. It's moved to streaming.
Right.
It's for an RPG, and the market for that is so big that more than $250,000 gets raised because people are excited about the possibility of playing that. And that's a Green Ronin product, and of course, some of those people are just going to buy it because they're fans of the Expanse, and that's great, right? Everyone's money is good money in that regard. But some of them are going to enjoy the experience of role-playing. And so the fact that we've got a television show that became a cable streaming show that has become an RPG means that there are going to be people that go back to this stage and say, well, what other RPGs are there out there? What else can I do? How many companies are doing this? And so that bigger and bigger and bigger cultural acceptance changes what becomes a viable way of doing things.
Well, and we look at all of the crazy that goes along with that. If we look at how many people are watching streaming role-playing games as just, well, this is entertainment for me. And there's plenty of channels on Twitch, on YouTube, that offer these things up there, and you can consume that as just regular media. And there's people that are trying to make a living off of doing it just on Twitch, and they stream all the time, running games, basically every day, and there are enough watchers to make that feasible. And to me, that's like, wow. And I only recently, like within the last 6 months, really got into the enjoyment of watching other streamers, even though I've been doing this for a while. Uh-huh. I put it up there, Nerdarchy put it up there because we know other people are doing it, but I never really, found, the joy and how much that I can learn from others.
Yep. Well, and some of those things, some of the games have become such good story entertainment. I know people, for example, who do not like playing like the Dragon Age line of video games. They don't enjoy that. But they like the storylines. And so they will watch people play those games as a way to absorb those stories that happen to have come in game medium without having to get good at learning how to play the game. So this is another case where there's been a technological change that the video games are better than they ever used to be, right? No one got excited about the story behind Asteroids, or
what about Tetris?
Yeah, right. I mean, the Russian music was kind of cool, but there wasn't even a Tetris animated show, unlike say Pac-Man. But that technology, that video game technology, now has stories interesting enough that people want to absorb it. The streaming technology is now advanced enough that it is easy for one person to play it and other people to watch them. And once that audience hits a certain size, it can be worth it as a financial endeavor to say, hey, you can just drop $1 as a tip. And then if I stream every day and every day 100 people are dropping $1 as a tip, then that becomes a valid source of income.
Yeah.
I have a Patreon, which is just people who are supporting my blog writing. And that tends to be between $200 and $300 a month, right? I'm not giving a specific product that this thing will happen on this day and you give me that much for it. It's basically a complex tip jar.
Right.
But that $200 to $300 a month changes what is viable for me, right? I can now come to Gen Con on my own dime and meet with other people and have opportunities I wouldn't have elsewise because the technology means even if only a tiny percentage of the gaming public cares to give me money, that tiny percentage can find me, there's an economical way for them to pay me, and I can generate content keeping in mind who is my audience, what are they enjoying, what can we do with this? And so more games get created because there are more mechanisms to absorb them, which means more people get involved, which means there's more games created.
And all of these things actually, stem from the fact that we have this digital medium.
Yeah.
We have social media to share out there and to connect with other gamers. You have the ability to game online. You have the ability to watch, these people streaming. And you have, I happen to be a lone gamer living in this town, and there's no one around me that games. Well, even if I'm getting, picked on or what have you at school, I can go home and I can talk to my real friends.
Yeah.
I can talk online or, just type on whatever social media you prefer and connect and, feel better about yourself because you found others. I was fortunate enough to grow up in an area where I found a significant number of people who were gaming, but I've heard plenty of stories where it's like, I consumed these books and I love them, but I couldn't find anyone that actually gamed. The Stream of Many Eyes, Deborah Ann Wall from True Blood and Daredevil had come on as a game master, and she did a video on D&D Beyond where she talked about I loved D&D as a kid, but I didn't know anybody, and this is somebody who is now out in Hollywood talking about this stuff, and she loves D&D. She loves gaming. But she grew up in an area where there was no gamers. She couldn't find anybody. And as when she was a kid, there was no social media. There was no internet to reach out and find people.
I mean, I first got into gaming in 1982. I was on vacation and my uncle had a DMG for first edition AD&D. And that's all he had. And he was not aware that it was not a complete game. And he told me, if you can figure out how to play this, we'll play it with you. And so I looked through that book and I just absorbed it. And I'm like, well, I can see what information we're missing, so they refer to it. So I made up stuff to replace the missing information. And I'm sure it was terrible, but I was literally designing RPGs before I ever got to play one because I had to design it to play it. And that was a great summer, and I had a great time. And then I went home, and there are no other children in my neighborhood. And it was summer, so there was no school to go to. And I almost dropped role-playing because there was no one to do it with. And the only reason I didn't is that my mother, who I refer to as the Empress of the Geeks, was part of a science fiction club at the University of Oklahoma. So she saw that I wanted to game, and I couldn't find anyone my age to do it with, and I was not happy, and she went and talked to the people at that club, what can you do? And one of them said, well, Tunnels and Trolls has solo adventures, so you could buy him some of those, and he can play by himself. And Tunnels and Trolls had this vast collection of solo adventures, many of which were interconnected. You had, here's the city, and this one sends you the sewer, and that's a different book. And so for a few years, solo adventures was the main way I played role-playing games by myself, because there was basically no internet. There was certainly no internet that I had access to. There was, DARPANET and stuff. And it was only when I made it to high school that people saw me hauling around these books, and that became like our gang sign, right? We're flashing. I had those, and another kid had Starfleet Battles, and another kid had Car Wars, and we were able to say, that is a geeky thing. I see you, we can have a conversation.
Right.
And that's where my lifelong friendships formed, and I started playing more. But if it had not been for that one coincidence of my mother happening to talk to someone else who's a gamer that knew these things existed, it would have been just something I did one summer and then couldn't ever do again.
Now, could you imagine, the rest of your life, we're talking, 35 years, if my math is correct, of not being involved with this?
I mean, I would be a different person, totally. In fact, I might not be here. I've written more than once that because I was a very big nerd and bullying was a thing where I was, and depression is something I've worked with for my whole life, RPGs literally gave me a social connection to other people. I might not have survived without it.
And
so
we've gotten those stories as well.
Yeah.
It's like, gaming has saved my life. And it's like, wow, you're having this outlet where you can de-stress, you can unload emotional stuff, you can build connectivity. Not only do you have the emotional connections with your character to other characters, but it builds friendships. Like I have people that I have gamed with for many years, and I would reach out to them, and it's like, it doesn't matter if we haven't hung out in 5 years, 10 years, if any of them called me or I called them, it's like, it's like no time has passed.
It is, it's weird.
Let's reconnect, and let's keep this going.
And again, those are things that technology makes easier and easier and easier. I don't do it often, but sometimes, like with you and I, we play games even though we're hundreds or thousands of miles apart. Pathfinder Society has online Pathfinder games that people can play. So you can play a role-playing game online. There are Fantasy Ground and the D20 tabletops that allow people to have this way to do this tabletop activity. The game hasn't changed, but the technology is changing the way people encounter and interact with and play those games. When I was first getting up, we would sometimes, in the 80s and 90s, if you wanted some cool music, you would go get a soundtrack and put a cassette in and try and have it paused to the right place and hit play for a dramatic moment. Now I can go to Sirenscape and get a whole soundboard, and I can have the sounds of a tavern in the background, and if you're doing Starfinder, for example, they literally have noises for these specific adventure paths. So you're like, there's this guy with this weapon, and this weapon sounds like this. So I can press a button and get pew pew pew, and it's a game-specific pew pew pew, instead of having had to pause the moment when the beast dies in Krull on the VCR. So if I want the dragon to roar, I can press the button with the corded remote.
I love you mentioning Krull. Turn.
Krull is one of Krull and Hawk the Slayer, and there was a time before Lord of the Rings where these were the good fantasy movies, and I unironically love them. I do.
My go-to for many years for battle music was the Anvil of Crom.
Yes.
Conan the Barbarian.
Absolutely.
Anytime I hear that, it's like, all right, roll initiative. Like that's my go-to. Years later, we wound up adding the soundtrack to Gladiator because there's a lot of good music in that as well. But those have been like this is where I go for game music.
Not to get too much off on a tangent, but for a long time we had the soundtrack to Battle Beyond the Stars.
Okay.
Which is done by Horner, who later did Star Trek and Wrath of Khan, and a lot of the same notes and keys and musical expressions are in there, and no one recognizes it because no one saw Battle Beyond the Stars. I know that's not quite true, but so it's great. It sounds like this major motion picture soundtrack because he did a great job with it, and it's this really, it's a Corman film, right? So a lot of people aren't familiar with it. And they're like, haven't I heard this before? No, you're thinking of Aliens.
So we have this evolution of gaming. We have it that it's entering into more mainstream through consumption of media with streamed games and more accepted TV and movie nerdy stuff. We have more games coming out because it's more acceptable and because more companies are willing to be like, oh well, I'm gonna try this and I'm gonna make this happen, and the gaming community is big enough that's like, okay, well, I'm gonna take this. And sometimes, okay, you might want to be, well, this area plays Savage Worlds, these people are into Pathfinder, these people are into Dungeons and Dragons, and there's large enough communities for all of these to really find acceptance and to keep these games going stronger and stronger, and it's really great. but as we have all of this happen, like, we get to see that, like, it's not just, oh, well, you're just some nerd. It's really the people who are doing it. They're finding, these emotional and friendship connections. It's become this great thing. I look at, the fact that there's over 70,000 people that are, here attending Gen Con.
Yep.
And it's the biggest Gen Con ever. And there's people like, I didn't go last year because it was supposed to be like crazy big, and this year is even bigger, yet they came this year. You hear about how many thousands or hundreds of thousands of people are, willing to watch Critical Role.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter whether they're, wanting to watch to consume it, whether they're playing D&D, Pathfinder, or any other role-playing game. It's out there to consume. Like, so our nerds, are we really, like, are we taking dominance because of a very technology-based, world we live in right now? Like, it's really interesting.
I think part of what's happening is that people who aren't nerds or don't think of themselves as nerds have easy access to and are allowing themselves to consume these things that used to be exclusively nerdy. And it's easy to find. It used to be that if I wanted to know what the new games were out, I had to have a physical copy of Dragon Magazine or White Dwarf or Space Gamer, right? I've got to have a magazine
Right.
to flip through to see that there's a Dragon Bone available that will randomly generate a number from 1 to 20 or 1 to 100. And that's high technology. These were my options.
Right.
So I had to engage in something geeky, pick up these magazines to find out about something geeky. Now, if I am intrigued by Game of Thrones, and I just want to find out, hey, are there more Game of Thrones things? I can type Game of Thrones into Google, and it'll pop up. Oh, here's the Game of Thrones books. Here's the Game of Thrones miniatures game. Here's the Game of Thrones role-playing game. Here's it turns out Song of Ice and Fire by Green Ronin is actually Game of Thrones if you don't happen to know that title.
Right.
So I've done something perfectly reasonable. I've done a little bit of research in something I'm interested in, and all of that geek material is presented to me without me having to go to a game store. And I think game stores are very, very important. But I have, at times in my life, lived places where there was not a game store in driving distance.
Right.
So having alternatives to that, I think is very, very important. I still love my local game stores because I can go and say what's in, what's new, what's good, and those expertise are useful. And I don't always have a good place to game, so the game store is a game space. I think those are very, very important. But I also think that there are things like 8-page PDFs. There's no economic viable way for that to get sold in a game store, right? It's not big enough. It's not going to get printed. The margins on it are tiny. But that can now be sold on the Open Game Store or Paizo.com or DriveThruRPG. So that is a thing that just wouldn't have survived in the old days.
Absolutely.
That now you can make it, you can make money on it, people can do it.
So really all of this, I think, really boils down to accessibility.
Yeah.
You got accessibility of products, accessibility of information, and accessibility of support, whether that be in contacting publishers, designers, or friends, people that are like, oh, well, I'm going to help lift you up.
Yep.
So I think that's just an amazing thing for the culture, for the hobby of all role-playing games. I want to thank you for coming on and talking with us today. Do you want to, go through your spiel one more time, tell people, where they can find your stuff and who you are?
So the easiest place to find any of my stuff is OwenKCStephens.com. That's my blog. It's supported by my Patreon, and every article has a link to my Patreon. I'm also on Twitter, Owen @Stephens, I believe, or maybe Owen_Stephens. If you ever want to find me, do a search for Owen K.C. Stephens, and I'm the only Owen KC Stephens out there, which is why I use those initials. And then I also do a lot of work at Paizo.com and GreenRunning.com, so you can find a lot of my work there.
So if you want to continue the conversation about the evolution of tabletop role-playing games, down in the comments below, share your stories, share your thoughts. While you're at it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, stay nerdy.